Well, welcome to African Philosophy Conversations. It's my great pleasure to be here with Dr. Michael Onyebuchi Eze. Dr. Eze teaches currently at Leiden, but he is taught in many other places. He's got not one, but two PhDs. And so why don't we start off by Dr. Eze telling us a little bit about how you got into philosophy in general and how you got into African philosophy.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not, I think sometimes I feel like I feel very pretentious calling myself a philosopher because I would rather call myself a historian. I mean, yes, I have two doctorates and none of them is in philosophy. My first PhD is in history of ideas and from Germany, and second PhD from Cambridge is political science. So, of course, I have undergraduate degree in philosophy and master's degree in philosophy. So that puts me in a kind of a unique place, a unique situation, because philosophy broadly conceptualized, well, history of ideas is philosophy. But professionally, like having a PhD in philosophy, I don't have. So, but I'm happy to talk about it. So, of course, I have undergraduate degree in philosophy from the Jesuit school because I wanted to be a Jesuit priest. And part of the challenge, or part of the criteria is to be a Jesuit priest, you need to have a degree in philosophy. So part of the training. And of course, I went on to do a master's in philosophy. And then when I went to Germany for my first PhD, I wanted actually to do a PhD in philosophy. But then my mentor, Jon Rusen, the German intellectual historian, he told me, well, he's actually a historian of idea. If I want to do graduate school with him, then it has to be in history. And so that's how I actually made that switch, of course. Mm-hmm. And I think that was the best decision I ever made in my life, going to history of ideas. And without being equivocal about it, I think history of idea, apologies to colleagues, I think history of ideas is superior to philosophy. I think that may be provocative, but I think it is. So that was the best decision I've ever made to switch to history of ideas. So of course, history of ideas, a couple of ideas, and that's how I somehow find myself doing African philosophy in a professional way, because history of ideas, philosophy, all of them are just connected. So I went into African philosophy because the issues raised there were those that are very emotive for me. They were personal. And I as a historian, you need to understand the context of ideas and how it helps us to make emancipatory changes in our communities. And so I took the idea of an African concept to historicize it, and it exposed me not just to philosophy proper, but to political philosophy as well as epistemic persuasions and pedagogic references within Africa. So I came to philosophy, African philosophy, through the back door, so to speak. Yes.
Well, and I think taking an expansive view of the path that one takes into philosophy, I think is perfectly acceptable. I mean, Achille Mbembe's PhD is not in philosophy either. It's in history as well. I mean, there are many people who have made great impacts in philosophy, and in African philosophy, who did not, go through that particular door. I've talked to a number of people on this conversation whose first entry in was law. And so, I think there's, I am most happy to have you among our group of philosophers. And the kind of perspective of history of ideas, I think, is really interesting as well, because I think there's a certain sense that you can't know where you're going unless you know where you came from, especially within an African context, that history is so fraught with European, Western, excursions into Africa, which disrupted the history of ideas in so many ways. And so what I hope we can do today is to talk a little bit about that history of ideas as it impacts on African philosophy itself within the continent of Africa, but then also turn to the future and think about, just how or what implications that might have on looking forward. So the place I'd like to start is with a quick trip through political philosophy in Africa. I know that you teach whole courses on this, so it's a little bit presumptuous to ask you to, kind of summarize, in a few minutes. But if we're telling the story of political theory in the West, we're probably going to start with Plato's Republic or something like that, and we're going to go through a whole bunch of, forms of government, questions around, who should govern, what punishment looks like, what freedom looks like, all of those sorts of things. If you're telling the story about political thought, political philosophy in Africa, where do you start, and what kind of a story do you tell?
Yeah, there is, yes, it's an interesting conversation because, as you know, when we talk about African history, there's been this debate in African intellectual history about the role of epistemic spaces when you talk about identity formation. And when you come to Africa, there's this group of scholars that think of African philosophy, African philosophers, as those who speak and write of African philosophy as if they're writing about who they are, about their identity. It becomes what I call, in my own work, subjective reclamation in colonial structures. And then why this debate is important, because of course, the debate on the role of colonialism in Africa. We have those who argue that colonialism is just an episodic moment, the Badan School of History, that suggests that colonialism is an episodic moment that doesn't totally define African historiography. But there are those who says, well, it's not that episodic, because we cannot actually escape the residual impact of what colonial modernity did to Africa in terms of politics, history, and philosophy. So we have this debate and stuff like that. Those debates, they have merits, of course. One is about, the other argument say, well, African history, you cannot just speak of African philosophy, African intellectual history as a kind of a residual epistemology, residual epistemology of Western epistemology. What I mean is that, well, if we say that the totality of African history is just invented at the gaze of Western epistemology, it means that what we have as African philosophy, so to speak, is only responding to the epistemology that emerged in the West through colonialism. Right. And so to do African philosophy just to respond to the Hegelian, Kantian, all those racism that came with all those people and coloniality and stuff like that. But the other people say, well, so if we push that, then we know that we just epistemic, what I call colonization of subjectivity, we're just invented at the gaze of the other. On the other hand, the other people say, well, we can't do that. So we have to speak of African philosophy, African history as in broad totality, beyond colonial encounter and stuff like that, which has merits. Of course, that is very idealistic. And I think I go with Abiola Erele, who says, well, we might be idealistic about it, but we cannot really escape the impact of colonialism upon our life today. As Erele puts it, it puts us into a forced march. Hence, our emotional tribute to Europe, because of the kind of impact they have secured upon us. This is Abiola Erele. And this is a realistic way to look at it, whether we like it or not. And so you see that the grounding of African philosophy that emerged in the space of epistemic violence, subjective reclamation in colonial structures, because of course, colonialism is epistemic, comes with modernity, denunciation of the order, denying other people of humanity and stuff like that. It's epistemic ultimately before social policies emerge from that and stuff like that. And so you see policies like negritude, Pan-Africanism, Cuban negrismo, all of them emerging in context of saying, well, we need to reclaim Black subjectivity, because that is of Black consciousness movement in South Africa, even Ubuntu to some extent, authenticity, all of them emerging to reclaim a Black subjectivity from absurdity imposed upon it by colonial historicity. And so that is a space of epistemic violence. But the question then is, are we going to be entrapped within that space? To what extent can African philosophy extricate itself from just being a mirror, what I call residual epistemology, residual epistemology? To what extent? However, and this is a very important distinction, I also suggest that maybe being a mirror is not completely bad. Yes, because it's about identity. Well, it doesn't mean that even if epistemology is a mirror residual, does it mean that we cannot learn anything from that? Should we just say, okay, we don't want to be a mirror, therefore we concoct anything we like as philosophical, just because we want to avoid the idea of being a mirror? So you see that it's become very contentious. Unfortunately, to some extent, very, very, kind of revolt, refusal, rejection. Also becomes very emotive. These people writing about, if you criticize a scholar, sometimes if you criticize an idea, people take it personal, as if you're criticizing who they are and the totality of their being. And so this is how what we need to renegotiate and think and talk about and say, okay, what do we have as philosophical in that sense? Yes.
I mean,
so this is the context we find African political theory in this kind of debates.
And I mean, as I hear you kind of describing those tensions, I guess I go back. I mean, you mentioned negritude and some of the Black consciousness stuff, which was really that kind of reclamation project. But, I go to some of the early post-colonial, leaders in Africa, many of whom had a kind of, or aspired at least to a kind of intellectual underpinning to their nation building projects. So you think of Kwame Nkrumah, and consciences. I mean, you think of, Jomo Kenyatta, he writes Facing Mount Kenya. He's not a philosopher. He's trained as an anthropologist. Down the line, Senghor, in Senegal, once we get to the post-apartheid era, Mandela, and even more so after Mandela, Thabo Mbeki and the African Renaissance sort of notion. And so, and the list could go on, Kenneth Kaunda, Mugabe. I mean, so many people had this kind of philosophical underpinning, Julius Nyerere. I mean, the list goes on. So what do you think of those kinds of I guess I would think of them as attempts to kind of thread that needle or deal with that kind of tension that you just described, which is between the recovery of a kind of authenticity and a dealing with the realpolitik of the colonial, the wake of colonialism. Do you think some of those were more successful than others, or do you think that was just a necessary thing for people to go through? Or, what are your thoughts on that kind of early intellectual activity around nation building?
Yeah, that's a very fascinating question. First thing we need to understand is that the states that we inherited after so-called independence were arbitrary states. They were not historical states. That's one. Okay. And so what I mean is that because they're not historical, it means that honestly, even after they gave a baton of leadership to the new elite, they were just still colonial states. They were mostly bureaucratic dictatorships. And so you see that they existed because of monopoly of violence. There was no sense of nationalism. Okay, there was no, except the fact that they shared a common enemy. So you see that they had somebody who they all opposed, because these were arbitrary states. So people were just forced to live together for purpose of colonial domination. So you see that in Nigeria and Ghana, whatever. So they were able to stay together because the states that they inherited had a monopoly of violence to keep the people together within a territory, not because they have any shared sense of identity. So they were not historical.
So let me just interject here. So are you saying that those kind of high-minded sort of notions about the kind of quasi-philosophical notions were really kind of disguising that much more I'll use the word again, realpolitik sort of control of violence sort of notion? Was there anything to them at all?
But no, much more than that. These people were very smart. They were very smart. What they tried to do was to transform an arbitrary state into a historical state by trying to create a nation where none existed before. They were trying to transform the existing territory. So, of course, they needed a new ideology because the people didn't have any sense of nationalism. If you read the Kenneth Kaunda, for example, say sense of patria. How do you develop a sense of patriotism, love for fatherland? I mean, people who were just arbitrarily put together. So they were an attempt to make a nation, make a collective sense of identity where none existed before. This was an attempt to transform a violent or bureaucratic dictatorial state into a kind of something in the Euro-modernist sense.
Yeah.
The question becomes, to what extent did they succeed? And you see, if you weigh the communicarité in Guinea, Kwame Nkrumah conscientism, or if you try Julius Nyerere Ujama, you see Kaunda's humanism. These were all attempts to create a new nation out of the ashes of the past. Right. Because they had understood that what they had was still, and most Nigeria, for example, today is a colonial state. It's still the bureaucratic dictatorship. It's a bureaucratic state, dictatorship. So it's not really, because how many people subscribe to the idea of Nigeria as a sense of nationalism, where everybody share the same aspiration or love, the same thing, except maybe when they are playing soccer. Okay, Nigeria is playing soccer. Then, of course, people will wear green, white, green, they will love each other and stuff like that. But once soccer is over, everybody says like a geographical prison yard. People want to escape. Yeah. And so this was an attempt to create a nation, a nationalism where none existed before. And of course, they applied that, they tried to do this in doing that. Of course, the challenge was that they were doing that in the Euro-modernist sense. So here, philosophy, of course, was very critical here. And so this is what they tried to do. It's a response to transforming the colonial state into something African in a way. To the extent they succeeded is a question for historians.
Which you are one of. So, I mean, that certainly sounds like a plausible account to me, but I guess it raises the question for me, I mean, there are traditional forms of governments that go, that existed before colonialism came around. Some of them were monarchical. Some of them had councils of various sorts, councils of elders. People refer to these sometimes in juridical forms. So, for example, in Rwanda, people talked about getting back to, and I'm sorry, I don't exactly know how to pronounce this, but the Gacaca, G-A-C-A-C-A courts, which were an older form of court. Once you've had a genocide and much of the legal system is gone, you have to find some way of dealing with it. And so they turned back to older forms like that. People talk about palavers. People talk about all sorts of forms of social governance that, do you see those, the turn towards forms like that as a viable sort of idea, or is it in some sense, you can't ever go back? What do you think of the attempts to recover older forms of politics within Africa that might have been around before colonialism?
I think this is in my work, I speak about cultural reclamation as a step beyond the decolonization. You see, decolonization has tried to offer us new ways of thinking, to go into the past and bring out certain things, understand the history, understand mechanisms of the past, and see what can we learn from history and stuff like that. What decolonization doesn't do for us actually is that sometimes decolonization has a tendency to be selective, so that it forgets that history is not a location of innocence. And so what it does is that, well, if we are the victims of oppression today, but maybe we were victims today, but maybe in the past we were also villains and stuff like that. But cultural reclamation moves beyond just decolonization. So yes, we understand what happened in the past. In cultural reclamation, we reclaim everybody. In reclaiming everybody, we also reclaim the goods in the past, not just our own people, but also from different, even those we didn't like. Could they offer us something? Can we pick something we didn't like from them that we can also use to form our modern society? And that's what I would call a realist perspectivism. A realist perspectivism suggesting that, look, what happened in the past, maybe location of horror, but can we learn from whatever goods we can learn from the past and stuff like that? And so, yes, when we do, I'll call it cultural reclamation. What do we recall? From whom do we recall that? And to what extent would it accommodate the people who live in our contemporary society? Here moving away from ethno-nationalism to civic nationalism, to civic citizenship. So moving beyond, of course, the tribalist tendencies. So that if I can claim something from the Hausas or Yorubas from the past, or go to Gacaca, whose culture is being reclaimed? Can we get everybody involved? So it doesn't just become a reclamation of a particular tribal or ethnic trait in order to mobilize domination in the name of history.
Mm.
Because you can also use tradition as a source of as a tradition as a source of domination and power for the present moment and stuff like that.
Absolutely.
So when we reclaim, it's important, but who do we reclaim? So because sometimes you say we are bringing culture, but what do we use the past to do? We can use it as stuff domination. Those who, okay, this is us. We exclude those who do not belong to particular ethnos and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So yes, I am all for that. But I speak in terms of cultural reclamation, because culture by nature is dynamic, is always changing. And so we reclaim everybody from that past. And so when we talk about the Gachacha, whatever you reclaim, what about those who were agents in that past? How do they deal with that? What contribution can they make so that we who live in the present moment can learn from everybody who lived in the past, not just our own ethnos and stuff like that. We have to be very careful so that we don't just make a kind of a narrow-minded reclamation of our own people or only those we like and stuff like that. So yes, but let me take it further. These ideas, remember that they worked in a pre-colonial, I use the word pre-colonial cautiously. I'm not suggesting that Africa didn't exist before pre-colonial, but for the sake of argument, so these were smaller communities, smaller villages. The question is, while those things are very, very idealistic, wonderful, we want to think about that, it's beautiful in idealism and stuff like that, romantic to some extent, how do we, this is our own villages, how do we recall, how do we use those techniques to include those who didn't have shared the same ideals of communitarianism, talking about whatever the case may be. In Nigeria, for example, we talk about Council of Elders, village assembly, and so on and so forth. But what about the next village? What about the next city? What about the next ethnicity? Do they subscribe to that? What about those who think that women shouldn't be part of community, for example, or women shouldn't be part of a society? Of course, we say, well, we don't want women to be oppressed. And it's true, we shouldn't do that. My point is, how do we negotiate this kind of exigencies and past histories and traditions and cultures in such a way that everybody's accommodated, even if we don't like the way they are living, even if we don't like what they think, even if we don't like their own tradition. So we live in a cosmopolitan society whereby it's no longer a small village of 100 people and 30 people. And so that's the challenge. How do we make that bigger? Are we going to bring out the men in Nigeria and say, okay, sit down and talk? Is that the best ideal? Or should we, it's like saying, okay, democracy is a wonderful thing, and I subscribe to democracy, wonderful. But if we practice democracy as we practice in America, we impose it on Nigeria, what we have is tribal dictatorship. It doesn't work. The question then is, how do we make democracy work within the context of Nigerian experience and still be democratic? And so this is, I'm all for going back to those ideal romantic things, but we need to be realistic about it, so it doesn't remain in paper. A world that this is Kaunda now. Kaunda suggests that, yes, we cannot go back to that kind of small clustered societies. It's a nation where everybody is going to participate and feel a sense of belonging.
I mean, in what you were just describing there, I have about 100 questions I want to ask. I mean, I'm reminded of Foucault saying, history is history of the present, which is that, when we do history, we bring the concerns of the present to the past. And, I'm struck by that, not only in Africa, but elsewhere, of how the attempt to write the past by some, at least, is a very kind of heavy-handed sort of thing. It might be called populist, but it is really an attempt to kind of dictate a certain version of a pure past and then force, everyone else to come into line with that. And you get the most brutal regimes using that kind of logic.
I agree, because what's happening here, that history is invoked in such a way that it holds the president hostage. So that history holds the president hostage. It's the purpose of history to hold the president and then justify commitments to violence in the present time in the name of history. And so we need to avoid that.
So I'm also interested in, your comment about the importance of this kind of cosmopolitan sensibility, but at the same time, the recognition that maybe democracy in the kind of Western or American sense doesn't exactly work. And I think that's an insight that a lot of the early, post-colonial leaders of state recognized too. I mean, you regularly saw arguments for one-party states, among quite a number of people, and the logic always was, well, we can't simply have a kind of classic Western one person, one vote, because there's just so much, ethnic division. State borders are totally artificial borders, putting together people groups that, otherwise would not have been together in any way. They would have found ways to form their own nations quite separate from, these other folks that are now part of the polity with them. And so what we need is a single party government. Of course, we saw those devolve, more often than not, I think, into really problematic sorts of things. So if, Western democracy is problematic for kind of realities within Africa, but we've also seen other options that directly are trying to react against, react to those problems, as also having had their own problems, like single party states. What are the other options that do you think that we can go with? I know you talk about cosmopolitanism a lot. How does that manifest itself in a state? Let's take Nigeria, which you mentioned, which is so ethnically diverse, so linguistically diverse, and has such a history of violence and domination by some over others.
Yes, let me just be clear here. I'm a great believer in the Enlightenment project. That's why I make some disclaimer. I think the Enlightenment project is one of the most beautiful things that happened in intellectual history worldwide, all over history. One, I'm a great believer in democracy. However, of course, the Enlightenment, I like the good part. There are many things, stupid things about the Enlightenment that I don't want. So when I talk about the Enlightenment, here I'm talking about epistemic reclamation. I'm interested in reclaiming only the good part of the Enlightenment, dignity, all the rights, non-negotiable human dignity. I don't like the racism. I don't like the sexism. I don't like the provincialism. So those ones I don't reclaim.
You remind me a lot of somebody else of your namesake, my old friend Emmanuel Eze. He would have talked in very similar terms.
Oh, nice. Yeah. So I'm not in the bandwagon that just said Reclamation is bad. Yeah. Therefore, cancel Enlightenment or cancel Kant or cancel Hegel. No, I'm not in business of canceling anybody. Right. Kant, Hegel, Hume say some stupid things about Africans, but they also say some beautiful, wonderful things we could learn from that. We don't just say because he said he said some good things. We don't cancel Enlightenment because of those things. So the question is that look at what can we learn from Enlightenment? What can we learn from Hegel? What can we learn from anybody and stuff like that? We are in a place that we are grateful that we are not living the moment of history where we have to experiment. Of course, the Hegelian criticism of history, I go to Hegel that perhaps the problem is that the only thing we learn from history is that we have learned nothing from history. Unfortunately, that's the only lesson we never learned from history. That's the only lesson that we've never learned from history. Right. And so, in the case of Nigeria, I say when I talk about Enlightenment, there are virtues we can take, bring it, democracy. The question is, how do we make it work in the context of Nigeria? And we have wonderful people who can do that if the politics can be fixed and stuff like that. If there's kind of a political will to do so and stuff like that. So yes, I still want democratization, and I think democratization is the best thing Nigeria needs. But the question is, how do we define and redefine a Nigerian kind of democratization that will work for everybody, irrespective of their tribe, ethnicity, religion, and so on and so forth? Nigeria is trying to do that in a little way. They said, okay, we make this kind of a negotiation. We come, if the North rules this for 8 years, the South rules 8 years. That was okay, so that no particular group can be dominated. It brings a kind of, some peace, some kind of the peace. Okay, with everybody, nobody's feeling excluded. But what about other ethnicities are not included and stuff like that? And this is where the Nigerian elites and leadership have failed over time. Because if they can, that could be a way. How do we make democracy work for us? Because people are so hungry. But you also need to understand that, again, unfortunately, Nigeria is a failed state. So when there is no core-state powers, when the state institutions are not there, institutions of the state are so weak. When the institutions of the state are so weak, you can't talk about ideas when there are no institutions. Right. The institutions are so weak that how can you implement these policies in Nigeria when when the core state powers and state institutions are so weak. So you see that this is where the problem. So that what we need now is then civic education. During election, people will sell their vote for $1, and then they'll still suffer by the same people. They'll be oppressed by the same people and stuff like that. So this is where philosophy comes in handy. How do we educate the people, to change the mind of the community, to begin to think, look to the future and stuff like that? Yeah. It's a challenge. It's a challenge, and anybody trying to say that is a quick fix solution is actually gravitating towards intellectual fraud. It's not true. We need to start in elementary schools, in nursery schools, in primary schools. What does it mean to be a Nigerian in the 22nd century, or 21st century? That's a good question. And so this one need to recreate kind of what I call a creative regeneration of ideas to fit the context of experience. We can't just borrow American democracy and impose on Nigeria. It's a disaster. We try it. We impose it, it becomes a tribal dictatorship. It offers space for oppression and violence. So democracy, instead of being a source of dignity and life and freedom, becomes a source of violence, a source of oppression. The question is, how do we democratize democracy in Nigeria? How do we make it become relevant? As the Aristotelian and the McIntyre said, goods are internal to the practice of a community. All right, the universal idea of democracy is good. But as practice, the context of Netherlands and the USA and Canada, whatever I want to use, is different from Nigeria. The question is, how do we make it work for our own context? So it doesn't have to be,
Well, and I guess that points to the idea that, when we use the term democracy, we're not just talking about one thing, as you've been talking about here. It really is, a range of things. Nigeria is a very interesting case, I think, and I don't want to get too much into a single country's politics, but, it is the most populous country in Africa. And, it has a history of, political experiments, I guess you could say. I mean, it has a history of the eastern part of the country trying to break away and become its own country, and you end up with the Biafran War. It has a lot of history of the ways that things could go wrong. So finding that version of democracy that actually fits that kind of space is a remarkably difficult thing. I think those in the US who just think, well, all you need is a formative document, all you need is a constitution, and it just lays everything out, and there you go, and now we have our democracy, and isn't it great? That's a little bit naive, it seems, for the vast majority of states, not only in Africa, but I would say in the world. Localizing democracy is really hard. And so let me ask you one question about, you've written a lot on Ubuntu, which is the context in which you've written has been South African for the most part. One of your books is, a good part of it is analyzing the versions of Ubuntu. Do you see any hope for something like Ubuntu as helping us think through that problem that you've just established, which is, how do you find a democratic system that has that cosmopolitan feel, that has that inclusive feel, that brings all of the history back, and not just the history that, of the people you like, and forget about the people you don't like? Is there anything within Ubuntu that offers us any hope on that, or are there problems that will we'll have to deal with if we take that seriously?
Yeah, I think Ubuntu actually do offers a model for new democratization. Ubuntu will suggest this kind of a creative dialogue between people. When I say, of course, the cliche is already associated with Ubuntu. It's not necessarily that you go to the people you don't like. One of the scholars I like a lot, DJ Lou, for example, talked about the otherness of the other as well. Ubuntu doesn't say we're just only my people, but also those you do not like. And the way I put it is, go drink coffee with someone you do not like. And what Ubuntu does is this. Okay, for my own work and research on Ubuntu is it changes also our notion of dialogue. You see, in Western philosophy and also Western historicity, in my work, through Ubuntu, I've been able to redefine my notion of history from linear progressive to completely new way of thinking of the past, But most importantly, what Ubuntu helped me to rethink is our notion of dialogue and human reconciliation. And this is very important when we talk about when we live together. And what is this notion of dialogue? You see, when we come to the Western society in political conflict, we always want to have dialogue. But this idea of dialogue is always coming from Euro-modernist Western epistemology. It suggests that the purpose of dialogue is positivistic, which means there must be results. Right. So we have conflict. So, okay, let's go dialogue. Then we have an agreement. And we say, well, the dialogue negotiation is not going well. It's broken down. It's not going well because you go there already with a mindset that you're going to have a positivistic result. Now, in my own work on Ubuntu, I've come to rethink dialogue as mobile, it's supple. The purpose of dialogue is the end product. It offers us a space for what I call in my own work, this is a new word, might be a little bit jargon, but the word I coined is teleological mobility.
Okay.
Teleological mobility, which means dialogue is not for a positivistic end, but for the sake of itself. So, which means that we live together, we just need to keep talking to each other. All right. Sometimes we might have an agreement. Sometimes we might have consensus. Sometimes disagreement. Sometimes it's just what I call subjective conversion. So I use the term subjective conversion here in a democratic space is that it's not that I agree with you, but also to reach a high level of understanding why we need to live together. I do not like you, but I know why we have to live together. And this is why I think Ubuntu model, the idea of subjective conversion as a model of understanding. So it's not about that I go, you give me 10 euros, I give you 5 euros, that kind of positivistic, okay, you give me a piece of land, you take this factory here. If there is no material asymmetry or material result, then dialogue didn't work. No, dialogue in Ubuntu now, in the democratic space, dialogue is mobile, it's supple, it's always that kind of emancipatory. So the purpose of dialogue is dialogue. So the question is, let's give a concrete example. Ukraine, Russia, okay, let's talk. Keep talking. The purpose is to keep them talking timelessly. Let them keep talking. Do not go to this table of conversation with the idea of having a positivistic result. No, let them keep talking.
Well, and I'm with you on that, but let me give you another kind of scenario. Where let's say you have a union and a corporation, and the union and the corporation are talking over the terms of employment, and they keep talking and they keep talking for years and years and years and never come to any kind of decision where the workers get a raise or whatever. And in fact, maybe that's a tactic of the company to keep everyone talking so that nothing happens, right?
Yeah, I mean, yes, of course. I use this notion of dialogue in place of violence, when there is violence.
Okay.
Conflict resolution, of course. When it comes in the sphere of economics, that might be one of the limitations. Why might say, okay, well, just keep them talking, do not give them anything and stuff like that. But I'm hoping that if the authorities in the company are genuine, if they are genuine in talking to the people, to the factory workers, for example, they would have subjective conversion. They would recognize the reason why these people are actually, why they need more money, why they need to have improved condition. Because you go open-minded, so, okay, let's go have conversation, let's talk to each other. So if they are genuine, they would, on their own, come to terms with increasing the benefit for those that are negotiating. If they're genuine. The purpose is, and subjective conversion is more powerful than handgun negotiation. It's handgun, whatever. Shotgun negotiation. Subjective conversion comes from within. I think it's authentic. It's real. You do it without being forced. I think it's more real. It's more authentic than that. So you come to here. I know why you need this. I don't agree, but I'm going to give you this anyway. Stuff like that. It's in that sense. I think that is kind of dialogue Ubuntu teaches us, because it's humanistic, because the human agency is at the center of our conversation. So the reason why we're talking is because of us. We're talking about us. I think we're talking about us. This is why we are having that in the first place. So apply it to democracy, then you see a state.
Yeah. Well, but I think there's an interesting kind of tension here, and I'm on board with the way you just describe it, but I notice you go back to the idea if somebody is genuine, so in other words, there's a sense of, you need to enter into this with a good heart or with good intentions or with, the belief that we are all working towards the best or something like that. And I keep thinking about that kind of 19th century economic situation, that model where I don't need to care about your intentions about anything, right? I mean, or anyone else's for that matter, because in a marketplace, all I care about are your revealed preferences. In other words, what you do, not what you believe or what you think on the inside or whether you have good feelings towards me. And so what I operate on is your revealed preferences, what you do, and therefore on that basis, we make contracts with each other. And that allows us to not actually have to understand each other at all, but still we can get along in society. And so what's interesting to me is, we've talked about just the sheer diversity of especially nation states within Africa, given, the kind of crazy ways in which those borders were drawn up, and now the imperative of finding ways to operate. And on the one hand, you've got a kind of Ubuntu sort of, I would say, almost ethic, in other words, we are coming to dialogue in with good intentions, with a good heart, with the sense that we're all in a kind of shared project together. And on the other hand, you've got the possibility that I don't know what your real agenda is, but can we make a contract? Can we at least make a contract in order to do these things that are mutually beneficial? And you can go off believing what you believe and I'll believe what I'll believe, but at least we have that much. So, I mean, it feels like a tension there, doesn't it? I mean, when you have true difference, do you first have to have people coming onto the same page with a good heart? Or can you start by just saying, well, just make contracts?
Yeah, I mean, I get what you're saying. And I think I understand the necessity, I can't problematize the necessity of having a contract in the first place. What if the person doesn't want to talk to me? What if the person doesn't want to talk to me? That's a good question. What if, let me, an example I use in my class about when I teach this is, I like to drink coffee with Donald Trump when he was the president. I say, look, I know he wouldn't like it probably, but I would love to drink coffee with him because I understand that maybe encountering unmasks us and stuff like that. Right. Because what now, the problem with contractual engagement like that is the aspect of objectification of human encounter. Objectification of human encounter, and once it's objectified, it seems to me that the human aspect of it is. There's a distance from the human aspect of it. And so it becomes a piece of paper. It becomes a piece of paper. We have signed a contract. Okay, you have a signed a contract. You cannot go away from this contract. And it seems to me that there's so much more, at least from point of position of Ubuntu philosophy, than just contracts. That even if you break the contract, I might actually forgive you. I might understand why you break the contract.
Right.
And this is why I subscribe to subjective conversion that even we have a contract, don't break this contract, but then you go ahead and break this contract. Okay, but you're human before the contract. So that humanity, that dignity comes first before you breaking the contract. Of course, right. Going back again to Hobbes and Locke and the nature of why contract is necessary for us to live together and have a wonderful time. It's not wonderful, but the problem is it takes us back to square one. And what Ubuntu wants to do is to move away from this abstract relationship, right. And recenter the human person right. In terms of dialogue, so that human encounter is prior to any form of contractual obligations. That right. When you break that contract, is it possible for me to let go of the fact that you have broken the contract and stuff like that? How can I do that? And so it seems to me that subjective conversion is a way we can escape that, because right. Then we are the ones who make the contract. We're not slaves to the contract. We can always make a new contract. Okay, you right. break it, I understand. You are late to class. Okay, why did you come? Okay, don't come class again. Don't come late again. Right. In such a way, stuff like that.
Right. I mean, that's really interesting because, what you're suggesting really is that, yes, contracts matter, but our humanity matters more. And the first question we should be asking is why did that contract break? In other words, what human issue is at stake, and not what issue of exchange is at stake. But let me up the ante here for you. I'm going to make it even harder for you here. So the projection is that by the end of this century, some of the largest urban areas in the world are going to be in Africa. Lagos, Kinshasa, Dar es Salaam, Nairobi are often listed as being in the top 10 of largest urban areas in the world, some of them pushing 100 million people within their metro areas. So, you know, when some people at least think of Ubuntu, they think of something that is in some sense rooted in a kind of ethic and politics of the personal, of the ability to recognize somebody as a human, to exchange with them. You know, the notion of I am because we are is a small community notion, right? I mean, I can look out for the community when it's a small community. What happens when that community is 100 million people? I mean, is this scalable? Is it possible to think in terms of these ethical structures as being able to cope with the upcoming realities that are going to be in Africa?
Okay, I mean, let me just make it clear. Africans live in the world. Africans encounter the world.
Right.
Philosophy, like culture, is dynamic, it's creative. Right. So it's time for creative adaptation. It's epistemic adaptation, but creative adaptation. So the fact that Ubuntu works in a small community or it works at a certain time, or that you're in Lagos, doesn't mean that you are fixated to just African philosophy. This is a new society, it's a new time, it's a new era. The question is creative adaptation, epistemic adaptation. Okay, the question is that, I for one don't think that I'm part of the person. Well, if going back to Rousseau, if Rousseau offers me something that will work in Nigeria, I will go to Rousseau. And I think he does offer me something. If it's Fichte, if it's Hegel, if it's Aristotle, whatever, we live in the 21st century. The question, this is realist perspectivism. If Ubuntu, what else can I add to the table and stuff like that? Okay. Again, I do not speak in terms of epistemic hybridity. You know that I don't subscribe to hybridity. I'm always, I speak of confluence, confluence of identities, a confluence epistemology. So it's a negotiation, a creative middle of the keys that go back, the keys that go back. Not hybridity, because hybridity also suggests ontological violence that has to have a specific root in which others are grafted. So I run away from that, but the confluence. So no, African people don't live in they don't live in mass. They live in the world, and there are other experiments in Latin America, in China, in whatever it comes. Okay, it's working for them. What can we learn from that to add our own values? So this kind of it's a creative adaptation. It's a creative adaptation to make new meanings, make new philosophies that will be responsive to the people who live in the 21st century. I mean, philosophy is not just, we have to transcend the idea of philosophy just being a question of identity. It's a question of, we speak of philosophy because it's a kind of a revolt and refusal. A kind of, it's always about revolt, kind of a fight, reclaiming. It's not just about subjective reclamation. It's a philosophy, it moves beyond subjective reclamation. It's now, and what African philosophy can help us do about philosophy, and African history especially, is to move away from that kind of progressive mindset, but speak about what I mentioned earlier on as teleological mobility, in which, okay, how do we speak of a philosophical approach that will help us, everybody who live in our world today, even if they do not know about the past. Okay, something from the past, cultural reclamation of everybody in the past, but also creative regeneration. You go to China, it takes, maybe Confucianism can help us. You go to Hinduism and say, okay, what can we learn? We don't do it because it's not necessarily legitimate because it's Africa. No, it's not necessarily better because it's Africa. No, it's not necessarily better because it's Western. The question is creative regeneration and epistemic confluence that can be relevant to the people in that time. Everybody. And this is how we should think about political philosophy in Africa today. And
so it does become a matter of, what works in this place, right? I mean, I go on about place perhaps far too much, but, drawing in from, not only the African past, but the rest of the world, as you say, but it has to work. So there's a pragmatist feel to that. I'm interested in what you think. There have been a number of kind of ways of looking towards the future, I suppose we could say. African Renaissance in South Africa was kind of all the rage with Thabo Mbeki, after Mandela. It started with Mandela, I think. Ubuntu, of course, there as well. There's much talk around Afrofuturism, which I think is really more a kind of aesthetic and literary, an artistic movement than it is a philosophical one. But people will cite, even things like the Marvel movie Black Panther and things like that as kind of examples of Afrofuturism. And so I'm interested in your reaction to those kind of attempts to think the future in these variety of ways. I mean, what you've just talked about is very much a kind of almost a pragmatic sort of approach, right? Let's look at the problems, let's have dialogue, let's figure out what works, right?
Not just dialogue, but also epistemic dialogue.
Right.
Our knowledge should be willing to learn, gravitate from others. It's not just because it's Africa doesn't mean that it has to remain that way. It can be improved. It can be rehabilitated, because we live in a society that's moving forward and stuff like that. It should be rehabilitated to accommodate modern technologies, modern ideas, a lot of things and stuff like that. It's not a dogma. African philosophy is not a dogma. It's not dogmatic effusion of reality. It is kind of a discursive space for kind of that kind of epistemic mobility. Learn, rehabilitate, and stuff like that. And that is, if it is to be meaningful, if it has any legitimation at all, it needs to be open in that sense. No,
I'm totally on board with you on that. I sometimes make a distinction between what I call a mode of thought and a space of thought. And the mode of thought is a kind of way of thinking that kind of narrows down to a singular sort of, as you say, dogma. And so sometimes it's tempting to say, well, African philosophy must have these components and must say these things and must, interact with its past in this way. And that's that. Whatever else it is, it's not a space of thought. In other words, it doesn't, raise the possibility of fundamentally differing sorts of ideas within that space that can then come into that epistemic dialogue that you are talking about. But what do you think about those things like Afrofuturism and the rest of, are these fruitful ways to think about the future? Is it simply a kind of imagination that can be used to kind of spur real philosophy and real action, or is it just an attempt to valorize a version of the past which some people find appealing?
Yeah, I think as far as ideas goes, I think it's something that it has an antique legitimation.
Okay.
When I speak of Afrofuturism, and again, when we talk about criticism of African philosophy here, to qualify it again, there is certain legitimation, people who want to really show the case again, because Western philosophy, some colleagues that do not recognize African philosophy or philosophies from Africa as philosophical enough. That's another extreme. That's complete nonsense, And so when people want to show, that's also a legitimate way to say, look, we cannot just dismiss African philosophy. It's philosophical because of so and so and so. My criticism is that we can't just stop there. We can't just stop there. Okay, we can't just stop there. Responding is not the only way we can do philosophy. Okay, now Afrofuturism, and in that sense, like Black Panther, and also we're talking about, it's something that I thought has internal coherence. Why do I say that? When you read Homer, when you read Odysseus, okay, we read them as myth, right? It's not as if, think of Homer's gods as honey gods running all over the place, Zeus and Athena all over, gossiping among themselves and all those things. Those things, we read them as, of course, from Greek, hoios, philosophical truth. They are myths. So there was not Achilles, half God, half man, but the purpose of myth is a historical address to understand the mindset of the ancient Greek society. Okay.
Right.
And then it's a historical address, but also philosophical truth. So that when we read Homer or Odysseus, to think of a Black Panther now, we do not necessarily read them as a factual truth, as mathematical truth, but historical address to understand the mindset of ancient Greeks, what they like, what they do not like. Now, this is a myth. Now, Afrofuturism is a myth. But what is a myth? Myth is not necessarily untrue. Okay, mythos now, the Latin equivalent, the purpose of myth is to move the mind of the community into action or inaction.
Mm.
So, and this is why it becomes relevant. So that when I have Afrofuturism, to move away, to transit from the kind of violence, from the kind of denigration of history, can we create a new future to compare the man of the community into positive thinking and rehabilitation of society? So this is where history becomes important now. It's no longer about the past, but also about the future. We are making new history ahead. So history is ahead of us. The kind of life we want to live. And the history that tells us this is a compulsion, moving the man of the community. Yes, it's not a loss. We're not a prisoner of the past anymore.
Yeah.
The future is progressive, it's beautiful. And so, yes, it is wonderful. And such ideas are necessary because, again, myth to move the mind of the community. That is the purpose of myth. It's not about true or false. It's not true or false. Right. It's compulsion to move the mind of the community into action and inaction. Then it becomes normalized, regularized, and then people begin to act according to those normative frames.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's
this is the interesting thing about Afrofuturism, and this is what African philosophy does when it becomes a kind of the idealistic frame through those kind of things. I'm not sure if I'm making sense. If I'm
I think that's a really interesting way to approach it, because I think sometimes it's possible to think about Afrofuturism somewhat too literally. And if we take the example, and I know it's not the only or even maybe the best example, but Black Panther the movie. Do we want to, valorize what's essentially a monarchy? Do we want to valorize, I mean, there's a sort of notion in that movie that, all the problems of society have been taken care of by the fact that there's this natural resource that came falling from the sky, that's transformed everything. And I mean, there's certainly a utopian feel to it, but I think your approach is, really a useful and positive one, because that's not the point, right? That stuff is not the point of thinking about Afrofuturism. The point is to articulate a positive view of a possible future, so we can look at, even other examples like Sun Ra, and other, I mean, he's much further back, but, some of the science fiction, some of that, and what does it mean to live affirmatively into the future? What does it mean to live joyfully into the future? All of those sorts of things. Let's start getting some examples of that out there. And no, it's not about the details. It's about the joyful living.
Exactly. Yeah. We are creating new history, making a new history. We are compelling us to rethink about what is already accepted as given and stuff like that. Right. It's myth, of course, but it's not because it's untrue. It is to move our mind into certain ways of thinking in that ways. So the coherence and the legitimation is purposeful to do that. This is what myth does. So when we read Homer, we read Iliad, we read all Hesiod, we read all those guys. This is what happens. And then, of course, and they draw meaning from that. And then we discuss it. And it's philosophical and so on. So this is what I think Afrofuturism in those kind of things. This is how I interpret it. This is how I interpret it. The future is promising. The future is promising. The future belongs to all of us. That's moving away from that discriminated, exclusive past. So a move away from a past that has held us hostage for centuries to a new future, a new thinking, a new script, an epistemic script in which everybody would find a home. It belongs to everybody. It belongs to everyone, irrespective of whoever you are. And I think this is beautiful. It's a beautiful contribution. It's a beautiful contribution.
Well, I've held you here for an hour at this point, but let me ask you one last question before we go. It's the usual last question I have in these conversations. And so you're teaching in Leiden now. You've taught at Cambridge. You've taught in various places. And I'm interested in how you bring new students into African philosophy. I mean, you teach African philosophy, but then you teach more general courses as well. How do you get students interested? Is there something you give them, get them to read? Is there something you tell them about that might, kind of pique their interest in African philosophy?
Well, in Leiden here, I'm lucky that we have a very interesting program, I think unique in Europe, global and comparative philosophy. I mean, we have every year in philosophy, we have 210 intake for philosophy. and 100 of these students come for global and comparative
Wow,
philosophy.
that's great.
So that's huge. That's huge. So we have Buddhist, Islam, Hinduism, African, and Latin America, which I represent, which I am the head of in charge of the cohort for that one. And so I already have a choir. I have an audience already.
Okay.
People who are motivated students coming from all over Europe to come and study. So that makes life easy, you know. So the question then is, how do you sustain the interest when they've come in? How do you sustain, you know, through debate, through kind of conversation, exposing them to different ways of thinking, the one of philosophizing, by actively engaging them, you know, in this kind of thinking and stuff like that. Students are always very curious. Those who come to study philosophy are often very curious ones. And those who really, philosophy is not an easy subject, just come and do for fun. So anybody registered for philosophy is already highly motivated students. So that makes life easy already. And so in that sense, it's sustaining the engagement. So here I'm lucky, or we're lucky that we have this huge interest from all over coming to a global and comparative track in Leiden. So that is already easy. It's about sustaining the interest. And I do sustain the interest. We do engaging them, you know, making it more creative, you know, making it more creative, different ways of learning, which is different ways of teaching and engagement. And they said it's not just philosophy from non-Western perspective. I mean, philosophy is philosophy, but also you see that it's also practical way of living. It's not just armchair tourism. So you know, some tasks they do, some conversation, the kind of conversation they have. A couple of years ago, I took some students to France, and we talk about food and philosophy on radio. So we're cooking food and we're philosophizing. This kind of practice, you see that, you know. And so this kind of focus, you know, and they will see philosophy, but the beautiful thing about global and comparative is philosophy is humanized as well, and they love it. They like it. And African philosophy generally is humanized. It's not just armchair tourism. It will do the armchair tourism, but after all said and done, it moves then to virtue epistemology. It's gravitated towards virtue epistemology, which is the benefit. And so engagement, encounter, and all these kind of things is how, and my students say, I'm lucky to say that they don't drop out. They don't drop out. Yeah. You know, they don't drop out, you know. So you create a kind of, like you do in your own space, in African space. So, you know, kind of create a community of learning, you know, and then they like that. So it's also about the teacher, and also it's not just the way you teach also make the student interested and stuff like that, because I'm sure some other people can do it and do it differently. Yeah, but this is how I do it in Leiden, at least. In Cambridge, it's a little bit different because in political science, it was in political science at Stanford, it was African and African American studies, so it's more towards Africana philosophy and so on and so forth. So yeah, in Zimbabwe, it's African philosophy and stuff like that. So other places in Germany, it was also toward decolonization and African philosophy. So in Nigeria, it's African philosophy, African political philosophy. So it depends also on the context and stuff like that. Yeah.
Right. Well, great. I think we're going to wrap it up here. So thank you so much, Dr. Michael Onyebuchi Eze has been with me. He's at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands. He's written extensively on all the things we've been talking about and much more. Thank you very much for the conversation.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. And then I think your book is one of the ones I would recommend. Your new book coming out, I think it's a book I would recommend for students to read. Well, I highly recommend it. Yes.
That one's coming out in the fall, so we'll talk more about it later. Anyway, thank you very much.